Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you very much. We understand it's a very busy session, so we really appreciate taking the time to join us today. Welcome to this side event on the human rights of future generations and sustainable development. Just a housekeeping rule, please note that this event is being live streamed and also only organizers are allowed to take pictures or record the event. We have the pleasure today to have with us very esteemed panelists. We have His Excellency Maastricht Principles, Permanent Representative of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg to the UN in Geneva, Professor Surya Deva, Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development, Ana Maria Suarez Franco, Permanent Representative of FIAN International in Geneva, and Milun Kotari, Member of the Drafting Committee of the Maastricht Principles. I am Francesca Mingrone from the Center for International Environmental Law, and I will be moderating today's event. The reason why we wanted to have a moment to discuss the rights of future generations is twofold. On one hand, international human rights law still has some work to do to fully acknowledge and implement the rights of future generations. And on the other hand, there are a lot of developments ongoing with regard to the rights of future generations here at the Human Rights Council, but also at the General Assembly. Looking at international human rights law, as we will also hear from Professor Deva, while the main covenants and convention do not acknowledge explicitly the rights of future generations, they do also not explicitly avoid them. And so this distinction between present and future generations is one that we have created ourselves, but it is not derived from custom or written laws. Also, international bodies with the mandate to interpret human rights law have acknowledged various times that future generations are rights holders. We can think, for instance, of the Human Rights Committee, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, or more recently, the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. And the very concept of sustainable development, it's rooted itself in the idea that future generations do have rights and interests. And if we look at international environmental law, the principle of intergenerational equity is a cornerstone. The Council and the General Assembly also have acknowledged many times that the triple planetary crisis poses a threat to the rights of present and future generations. And as I was mentioning, the international community is confronting itself with questions related to future generations. In December, the International Court of Justice will deliver an advisory opinion that looks at the obligations of states vis-à-vis both present and future generations in the context of climate change. And also the Inter-American Court of Human Rights will look at the question through another advisory opinion. In September, the international community is expected to adopt a pact for the future and a declaration of future generations in the context of the Summit of the Future. And of course, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development will be presenting his report on the rights and the right to development of children and future generation this Wednesday. So our panelists will take stock of all these and more other developments. We'll discuss what's the role of human rights institutions in advancing the recognition of the rights of future generations and identify gaps that need to be filled. Without further ado, I have the honor to give the floor to Ambassador Bischler for opening remarks. Please, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Francesca. And good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for being here. First of all, let me thank FIAN and of course Special Rapporteur Deva for organizing today's event. Also a warm hello to the co-panelists. I should start by saying that Luxembourg has expressed support for the Maastricht Principles at two previous side events, both here in Geneva and in New York. And we welcome their sharing at this event and elsewhere in the UN. As my colleagues from the mission reminded me of, there is a saying by an early 20th century trade unionist, namely Upton Sinclair, that a saying that fits our current predicament well, and it goes like this, quote, "It is hard to get a man and a woman, I should say, probably, it is hard to get a man and a woman to understand something is his or her salary depends on his or her not understanding it." This is the current moment in which unscrupulous industry practices continue and extract, refine, sell, burn fossil fuels despite overwhelming evidence of their devastating impact on the environment, aggravating climate crisis, causing pollution and eroding biodiversity. Children and young people are with us today, but are also the ambassadors of the generations coming after us. They are telling us loud and clear that our modes of production and consumption are unsustainable and will gravely impact their lives and those of their future children and grandchildren. They ask us to trust the science, the scientists of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as well as every independent climate scientist on the planet who warn us as loudly as they can. But against the voices of reason of children and scientists, there's also a roaring storm of disinformation and propaganda, authoritarian politicians who are amplifying the most strident voices of a cultural war, questioning science and the very idea of positive sum cooperation for a better world. The Secretary General of the UN has tried his best to corral the member states in the direction of a pact for the future and its annexed declaration on future generations. The latest version is still under silence procedure until tonight, 11 p.m., and it is widely feared that the silence will again be broken. The trust gap between North and South, between authoritarian regimes and democratic governments, between conflict parties, between historic enemies, seems simply too wide right now. This trust gap will not be possible to bridge easily by dialogue, and by dialogue alone. It will also require fundamental readiness to question our own blind spots and the courage to call out injustice wherever it takes place. Young people and children have let us know that they will no longer accept excuses like it's too complicated. We owe it to future generations to accept no double standards or hypocrisy. In the field of technological advancement, especially digital technologies, we witness time and again how technologies are developed and marketed before their impact on human rights is properly ascertained. Almost as soon as they are rolled out, all too often many of these are misused for surveillance and repression, to spread disinformation and undermine social peace. Especially in the field of artificial intelligence, building in human rights compliance as a guardrail against exploitation or human rights abuse is indispensable so that technology can be used for the common good. States need to build on the work already done at regional level or by mechanisms of the Human Rights Council to craft regulation that encourages innovation but also protects human dignity. This is not a reason for despair, but to remember what we've already achieved and how far we have come. And while our technological progress seems at odds with our slowness when it comes to changing our minds, it is important to realize that change is possible and it is happening. From the massive switch to renewable energies going on in many countries and around the world, all the way to the global movements demanding positive change and the fulfillment of human rights, both in the streets and online, a just tradition, as many call for, is not only feasible, it is already underway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. You touched upon many of the points that the other panelists will delve into. You mentioned the Maastricht Principles, and we will hear more from Anna Maria about what these principles entail, and the Special Rapporteur also does mention them in his report. You also mentioned two important points. To protect and promote the rights of future generations, well, first of all, we should recognize them more explicitly, but also address the root causes of the environmental disruption that threatens these very rights. And you rightfully mentioned fossil fuels and the role of science also to inform states' action. And of course, you did touch upon the Pact for the Future, and we will hear more from Mr. Kotari about what's the state of play of the current text, how it could be improved since there is no consensus yet. And of course, the important point about trust and polarization of the international community. Unfortunately, global threats like climate change, pollution, biodiversity loss should go beyond the global north North and South divide. And so hopefully also these kind of events can give us some food for thought. And indeed, the report of the Special Rapporteur also provides some potential way forward. So over to you, Professor Deva. As we mentioned, you will be presenting the reports on the right to development of children and future generations. Today, you will be following focusing at this event on future generations, but on the 19th of September, there will be another side event focusing on the children dimension of your reports. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Francesca. As I'm also one of the co-organizers of this side event, so let me also welcome all the participants to the room for finding time out of your busy schedule in the council to join this conversation. I would also like to thank Ciel, FIAN, as well as Ambassador Bachelor for, and of course other panelists, including Milan, for finding time to join this panel. So in my brief remarks, and of course I welcome you to look at the details in the report that I'll be presenting hopefully on the 18th, depends upon how the council's schedule goes. Let me start with the basic question. Who are the future generations? Because sometimes we may assume everyone knows and have a common understanding who the future generation is. In my report, I have articulated, in line with the Maastricht Principles, that the future generations, we should take it to refer to those generations that will inherit this planet, this earth in future. That means that we should not confuse and conflate children as part of future generations, because children are part of the present generations, they do exist now. So I think that conceptual confusion is important, and I understand why this confusion arose. Because if you would like to raise, especially before a court of law, issues about future generations, the court is going to ask, who are you? What is your standing? And I think children have been used for future generations as a proxy to enter those remedial processes and litigation in many jurisdictions. But that should not allow us to make this confusion that children are part of the future generation. So that is my starting point. But in my report, I push the envelope a little bit. And I go beyond Maastricht Principles, because Maastricht Principles are articulating human rights for human beings who will be part of the future generations. But in my report, I argue that we should look at this concept of future generations beyond human beings. All species who will inherit this earth should be regarded as part of future generations. That will include plants and animals. And that is what I'm promoting as part of my mandate, that we should not confuse right to development to merely economic growth or development. This is a very holistic right, and I'm promoting this idea of a planet-centered participatory model of development. If we leave behind rivers and lakes and plants and animals, human beings will not survive. So we need to reimagine the idea of SDGs where we say, leave no one behind. That is important. We should not leave any human being behind. But we cannot afford to leave behind mountains, rivers, lakes, plants, and animals. And that is where I'm saying it's not people-centered development that will matter. We need a more holistic vision of development. So my remarks are in line with this vision of development where the world should be going. In my report, I try to outline the historical evolution of this concept of future generations, and it goes as far as back to 1972 Stockholm Declaration. If you look at Principle 1, it is very clear. It talks about that we need to protect the environment for future generations. Of course, the 1986 famous definition of sustainable development. And you can go on and look at the Rio Declaration of 1992. You can look at the Vienna Declaration of 1993. And I think that is where I would like to encourage everyone to consider that right to development perhaps is a more progressive human right which acknowledged the rights of future generations much earlier than the other human rights. That is what the Rio Declaration is talking about. That is what the Vienna Declaration is explicitly mentioning. often those elements are ignored of the right to development. And that is what I'm trying to correct, those misinterpretations and misconceptions. I will not talk about the Maastricht Principles or the Pact because my colleagues will touch upon that. But I'm a bit disappointed with the Pact, including the Declaration of Future Generations, because the declaration does not mention the rights of future generations. It talks about the needs and interests of future generations. So I see the positive that we are having a declaration specifically on future generations. But if we are doing this in 2024, and we are doing this for the future of this world, I think this is not ambitious enough in my view. Rights matter. And of course, I'm not suggesting that the rights of the future generations will not conflict with the rights of the present generations. They will conflict. But the international human rights law provides a balancing tool when the rights do come in conflict. But if the future generations do not merely have rights, they merely have needs and interests, then that is not going to win against the rights of the present generations. So we can keep on talking about the interests and the sustainability of development and all this, but unless we have the same status between the present generations and future generations, I think we may not make much progress. So with this in mind, in my report, I talk about that we need to build a new ecosystem that supports the rights of the future generations. And I provide 4 concrete suggestions for that. One I already mentioned, we need to move towards the language of rights. And I'm consciously not saying human rights, because remember, I'm talking about future generations, including beyond human beings. So I'm talking about the entire ecosystem of life on this planet, and everyone has those rights. And I think those are independent and absolutely necessary for the survival of human beings in that world. The second suggestion that I have is that we need to embed the principle of intergenerational equity in the decision-making processes. So whenever governments, development banks, and businesses are doing an impact assessment, or they are conducting human rights due diligence under the international standards, they should not merely look at the adverse impact of their activities on the present generations. Rather, they should look at how that particular project is going to impact future generations. The government's talking about city planning. The countries in the Pacific thinking about deep sea mining. They must consider the impact of those activities on future generations, in my view. The third suggestion I have is about how do we ensure the participation of future generations? And I think that is a technically difficult question because they don't exist yet. But the law is creative. Law creates a lot of fictions all the time. We say that company is a legal person. It is separate from the shareholders. So I suggest we need to create representatives of the future generations. And in fact, there are examples in certain countries, which I mentioned in my report, from Canada, Germany, New Zealand, where ombudsperson, guardian, or a minister for future generations have already been appointed. So there are some institutional mechanisms where we can have representatives of future generations participating in those decision-making processes. And I will encourage that even courts should provide a standing to those representatives of future generations. And I will finish with my last point. That is, we need better financial planning and budgeting in relation to future generations. I live in Australia, and by accident, when I was writing this report, I discovered an interesting provision in Australia. It requires the government of Australia to conduct an assessment every 5 years that how its budgeting and the policies are going to impact next 40 years. So we already have a concrete example in a developed country, but of course we never saw it in the context of future generations. So when we are exploiting the current resources, when we are planning the budget, when we are taking public debt, we need to consider the impact on future generations. So someone on their behalf should be a participant to those conversations and decision-making processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Deva. These points are extremely helpful and give us a pathway for reflection, especially the idea of moving beyond the idea of the rights of future generations as only a focus on human beings, but also looking at plants and animals. And that's also in line with the development we see in the context of the rights of nature, especially, for instance, in the context of Latin American jurisprudence. And also the question of participation of future generations. Definitely the declaration and the pact have many shortcomings, but for instance, there is this proposal to establish a special envoy, for instance, to represent future generations. And indeed, the examples you bring from the national context are extremely important and highlight that indeed future generations are not just a matter of environmental protection, but of course so many different policy areas touch upon the rights of future generations, fiscal policies, for instance, as you were mentioning. And where you were talking also about the importance of thinking the planet as a whole, looking ahead of the generations to come, I could not think about, of course, indigenous peoples' tradition and practices. And for instance, these are also a body that did influence the drafting of the Maastricht Principles, for instance, because of course the future generations really are embedded in many of those practices. Speaking of the Maastricht Principles, which you touched upon, I would like to now give the floor to Ana Maria Suarez-Franco. She's part of the steering group of the Maastricht Principles on the rights of future generations. Over to you to, first of all, give us an understanding of what these principles are and why they are relevant. And it's also very uplifting to see that Professors Deva, but also an increasing number of special rapporteurs, international courts are referring to the principles. So let's see how they can help move ahead with the interpretation of international human rights law. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Francesca, to all of you for being here. It's incredible how many people we have today. And I will speak about the Maastricht Principles. Many of you have already heard about that, but maybe for others it's new, and therefore I will recall some ideas that we presented in the events that the ambassador mentioned, and also to some points of connection with the work of the Special Rapporteur. And maybe coming first to your question on why the principles, we have to remember that already in the 70s, when this first idea came, people were aware that we cannot continue businesses as usual, which means exposing the earth and present generations, but also threatening the future. And I agree with you, Surya, it's not only the people in the future, but all the environment that we need to live a dignified life. Now, after the COVID and with the current multiple crises, the situation is worse than in the 70s. The wars and conflicts that we have are threatening the present and future generations. We always hear about 3 or 4 wars, but we have 110 conflicts in the world, according to the Geneva Academy for Human Rights, in which also weapons of mass destruction and new weapons are developed, putting in danger our lives. We have the unsustainable patterns of production, which are not spread over the entire continent. They come more for the countries where we have very comfortable lives, where we live, but cause damage for everyone, especially for those who are not living this unsustainable. We have all the threats to global health as pandemics, which are connected to the zoonotic processes, which means we broke the limits between some environments that are not connected to the human environment, and this transmission of viruses and other kinds of organisms are threatening our health. And we don't know with which consequences for the future, similar to the resistance to antibiotics, for example. And also all the inadequately regulated and controlled new technologies. The ambassador mentioned it. Many of us may make use of the good uses of the new technology, but there are many dangers that are not foreseeable. And also the erosion of the democratic governance that, according to many of the civil society organizations, is being captured by private interests, where the public interest is subordinated to profit and destruction. This motivated a group of people already in 2017 to think, how can we improve international law to ensure that states have tools that can be useful to tackle these problems, together with many others that we already have, and so crystallize existing law, norms, and human rights standards to provide guidance and to ensure that any action strengthens solidarity with future generations in line with international human rights law. And here is the point you mentioned. It is solidarity in the framework of right, which means that states and non-state actors have obligations. Our expectation at that time was to inform, equip, and shape national, regional, and international governance processes, decision-making, standard setting, and jurisprudence. Another example, you mentioned the one in Australia. In Colombia, when the new mining law has been negotiated or was under negotiation, we had a hearing on how to understand public utility from the perspective of the human rights of future generations and nature. So this shows that it is possible to do practical things. But also, our interest was to promote social mobilization to advance human rights of future generations, which means we want the movements that are there to take this new tool that is useful to work for the future and those to come. The process was long, from 2017 to 2023, and we had different experts working in looking what was in the law, in the cosmovisions, in the traditions, in the cultures, but also very carefully on constitutions, laws, and jurisprudence. We had 8 working groups of people researching on different topics, of course, the environmental topics at the core, but for example, also the issues of debt and fiscal justice. And we created a reader of 125 pages that was the basis for our experts that drafted the principles to be able to write them. And Milun Kotari is a member of the drafting group, so he can tell us eventually. So the principles were adopted in 2023, signed by close to 60 human rights mandates, permanent and former, current and former special rapporteurs, members of treaty bodies, and many other experts. And they are therefore a legal document. It's not only a nice document written by some experts. Under the Article 38, 1b of the Statute of the International Court of Justice, the opinions of recognized experts in public law are sources of law. The principles are sources of law, and they crystallize the system. And therefore, they intend to guide human rights bodies, courts, decision makers, policy makers, national, regional, local governments to implement them and to cooperate on the light of these principles and in connection with specificities. I will try to go quickly through the content, but later in the conversation we can go deeper. We have a good preamble, and in the preamble there are many important aspects. I would like to highlight 3 that are relevant for our discussion. First, the preamble recognizes that looking into the ways of life and the contribution that both indigenous peoples, but also peasants and other rural communities can give us good guidance on how to look into the future. Very important, without gender justice, we cannot have justice and human rights in the future. And third, the cessation of unsustainable patterns of production, consumption, and lifestyles, as the ambassador said, is required to guarantee the full enjoyment of human rights today and in the future. And this means that we have to decouple development from the destruction of people and nature. And unfortunately, in the new Declaration on Future Generations, growth is still part of the concept. Milo will speak more about it. The principles also include some general provisions. Very important, it clarifies which are the legal basis for the principles. And very soon, in some months, we will have also a commentary which goes principle by principle explaining which are these legal bases, but also which are the global religions, belief systems, and cosmovisions that nourish the principle. We also have a definition, Professor Surya Deva already mentioned it, guides for interpretation of law, which could be the key to connect the three documents coming out from the Summit on of the Future with these principles and in general with the human rights law, and reaffirm the principles of universality and indivisibility. We also have a part on general provisions, and from this part, I would like to highlight that it is not only about intergenerational justice, how we respect the rights of the future generations, but also intragenerational justice. There is inequality in this world. And if this inequality perpetuates, it will be the cause of deeper violations of human rights for upcoming generations. Therefore, the principles in a way reflect what is the essence of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, knowing that we, those who live in a very privileged society, sometimes have a way to live that damages more those who are marginalized and more affected, for example, by the triple environmental crisis. The principles also have the tripartite category of obligations that we have in human rights: respect, protect, and fulfill, provide examples of violations, and those they guide the conduct of the state. And these examples refer to all the topics we have mentioned here, from ways of digitalization or solutions like geoengineering and how states should abstain. But they also include the principles of the precautionary principle and the principles of trusteeship, which are very important to ensure that no actions are allowed now that put in risk the future, the human rights of future. The principles, after looking into these three categories of obligations, go into the obligations, duties, and responsibilities of other actors. And here, very important, corporations that are devastating the planet, and some of them are the root of the crisis we are living, and mention that states should apply due diligence, but do not stay in due diligence. We need a duty of care, and we need accountability and liability mechanisms for non-state actors, for enterprises that are risking the human rights of future generations. The Special Rapporteur on Toxic Substances has given good examples on how the intoxication of the planet today can maybe not be visible for some of us, perceivable, but may hardly violate the right, for example, to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment for future generations. Finally, the principles include some provisions on accountability and remedies. But before that, also on representation, and representation means that since these generations are not here, but need to be represented, the representative bodies, like for example, ombudsmen, envoys, and others, should be inclusive, include those who are most affected, but also give a special position to youth and children, understanding that rights of future generations are not the human rights of cities. the accountability remedies, we have all those that are normally under the right to remedy, including, for example, the incorporation and implementation in domestic law, recognition of the legal standing of the victims by court, effective remedies, prevention, cessation, non-repetition, and redress, and the importance of the full and effective reparation. In many cases, if we rehabilitate the harm done today, we could impede that the human rights of future generations are under. So with this, I will finish, and I recommend you to look into the document because, of course, this was an extreme briefing. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Flores-Franco. You also highlighted some important points, but definitely the message is that the Maastricht Principles are supposed and hopefully meant to be a guide to really interpret international human rights law. And it will be interesting to see, for instance, if the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice will cite them, also the advisory opinion by the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. And on this note, it's perhaps useful to remind that in La Oroya and Peru recent decision by the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, the Maastricht Principles were referred to in the reasoning of the courts that states have obligations vis-a-vis future generations, including in the context of the right to healthy environment. Well noted regarding the centrality of equity, not just in the intergenerational but intra-generational dimension, and the question of corporate capture, obligations of private actors. Also in UN spaces, we are also always wary of calling them stakeholders, multi-stakeholder processes, but we really want to put the focus on rights holders rather to really highlight this need. Some points around the declaration of future generations have been made, but I would leave it to Milun Kotari to complement. We've heard the tension between needs and interests, and the fact that unfortunately the current pact and declaration do not have human rights language. So over to you to expand on that and perhaps tell us what a potential way forward might be.
Thanks very much, Francesca, and good afternoon. It's really great to see so many of you here for a side event. It might be a record of some sort. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming. So my fellow panelists have mentioned the triple environmental crisis, scourge of war, and a number of other issues. I want, in terms of sort of encapsulating the colossal global crisis that we have, I wanted to mention also global health threats, the erosion of long-established norms of democratic governance and civil and political rights in many countries that are posing profound threats to the ability of future generations to enjoy internationally recognized human rights. And there are a number of other issues, inadequately controlled and regulated new technologies, so on. So it's a time when it's and considering how all of these crises have evolved, it's actually quite surprising that the UN has not paid enough attention to the rights of future generations. So it's good to see that process underway at the UN. Let me begin by saying, speaking a bit about the process and the very unfortunate fact that this has largely been a state-centric process. I mean, in a way, it reflects the difference between how governments work in New York and in Europe. There's been hardly any participation of civil society. It's been very difficult to get governments, particularly representatives in New York, to receive contributions. And even meetings, even ideas to say, okay, there should be some experts who should contribute to the draft have not been met very positively. So there is, and apparently in the meeting itself, there will be no space for civil society participation. So when we look at the current draft of the Declaration on Future Generations at the UN, the Special Rapporteur mentioned the the obsession with interests and needs. It's actually quite shocking that after that this kind of backtracking is taking place 75 years after the commitments have been codified and all states have obligations to them. It's really very important that the declaration is harmonized with human rights principles, using rights, obligations, and accountability language, and certainly not the interest approach. I think we all know in this room how well human rights are defined in international law and constitute multilateral agreed language. So the obligation of states under human rights are clear, as well as the entitlements of rights holders. Interests are very vague, they're very diverse, they change or depend on structures and power relations of diverse world societies. So it's very, it's surprising to see this kind of language. And it's also inconsistent with the preamble of the declaration, which actually refers to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it refers to the UN Charter, but this is not carried through in the text. The second main drawback is, and Ana Maria mentioned that, that the draft misses reference to change production models that harm human rights, destroy the planet, and put at risk the enjoyment of the human rights of future generations. It's the language of growth is still carried through in spite of overwhelming evidence that if we really have to save our planet and ourselves, we need development to be delinked from the growth concept. And it's important that the declaration should foresee effective mechanisms that allow for assessing the impact of such development models, or such production models. And states need to agree in using all possible means to ensure a just transition to an economic and production model based on the principles of intragenerational, intergenerational, and intersectional justice, aiming to eliminate the risks and harms to human rights of future generations. And as I mentioned, the role and risks of artificial intelligence should be much more clearly referred to in the text. The other dimensions that are missing is one of the issues that it's actually very surprising that it is not there is the issue of is a lack of reference to accountability and remediation measures. Those of you who are interested, there's some very, I think, useful language in section 4 of the Maastricht Principles. There's also a complete lack of reference to the rights of peasants, for example. The indigenous people are mentioned. Fortunately, that's, so it again shows the sort of lack of consistency between the progress made here in at the Human Rights Council and what is happening in New York. Also, there's a complete absence of accountability of international financial institutions and the impact that they have. In fact, that's already clear, the impact that they're having their policies on intergenerational justice. Also, the text does not consider the risks of corporate capture, the use of science that involve pre-vested commercial interests and the power of large business in promoting certain policies of multilateral governance. And there is nothing about the need, there's a very urgent need to change the architecture of international financial institutions. And the other area that is not there, there's some language about traditions, but it's very surprising that the diverse belief systems and faith traditions followed by the vast majority of the world's population, which recognize the obligation owed by current generations to future generations, is missing. There is some language, as I mentioned, on tradition, but not faith or religions, and certainly not the issue of trusteeship. The issue of duties is very important. Article 29 of the Universal Declaration. Those of you who are interested, there's some language also in Principle 8 of the Maastricht Principles. And finally, I just wanted to express very deep disappointment that going forward, once this declaration is adopted and once the summit takes place, there is no mechanism foreseen except for a forum which will meet every 5 years of that they haven't decided. In the earlier draft, just 2 weeks ago, there was a mention of the need for a special envoy on future generations, but the recent draft has taken that out as well. So there is no clear sort of follow-through process, and the text itself as it stands now, and it looks very much like it's not going to change very much, is a major disappointment. So I think all of this being taken into account, it becomes incumbent on here at the Human Rights Council that remedies have to take place, and that government should not shy away from criticizing and being critical of the governments in New York for the severe backtracking that is taking place if this text as it exists goes ahead. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I will not try to summarize all the points that you highlighted, but perhaps 2 remarks. On one hand, really highlighting how non-participatory, unfortunately, the process of the negotiation of both the pact and the Declaration of Future Generations was, and perhaps the result has been that indeed there is very little rights language, and many of the dimensions you highlighted are lacking. And also you mentioned, as others on the panel, the question of accountability and remedy. And also this session of the Council is quite important because we have a very crucial report that has been presented very recently by the Secretary General on loss and damage in the context of climate change. And of course, Professor Deva will present a report also on loss and damage to the General Assembly. And of course, when we do discuss a remedy for climate harm, we need to include an intergenerational dimension. Before I open the floor for questions or comments, I would like to offer the opportunity to our panelists to provide quick reactions to some of the interventions that your peers have made. A question or a prompt that would come from me is, now that we take stock of what's happening or what is not happening, what can we do concretely to push the Human Rights Council and other human rights institutions to better include the rights of future generations? And looking at the shortcoming of the Declaration of Future Generations, this still is something that is going to be adopted. So is there anything that we can do to encourage states to implement it at the national level in a way that does take into account the rights of future generations? Who would like to start?
I can, in the interest of time.
Please.
No one. Thank you. I think I will be very brief because hopefully there could be some questions from the floor. I will say that we should leverage, despite all the limitations, whatever comes out of New York, whatever pact and the declaration comes out of, we should try to build on that. But I'm a great believer of the power of non-state actors. How we can, as the Maastricht Principles have been developed by not the governments, right? So how could we continue that path? How could we try to influence international law bottom up? So international law is a dynamic process. It is not always top down that you adopt a covenant or something at the international level and then states implement it. International law can also grow bottom up. And I think that is what I will be working with all the relevant partners, that how do we build that momentum bottom up in different cities, in different councils and provinces to promote this idea that the rights of the future generations matter and we must consider them. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. I think it would be interesting that states keep the human rights of future generations in connection with nature. I forgot to say that the Maastricht Principles do not recognize the rights of nature, but mention them. I mentioned the intrinsic relationship from humans with the nature. So you upgraded this. Thank you very much. Anyways, I think you should have in mind the human rights, the principles and the human rights on future generations in the negotiation of resolutions. I think in the different topics, every topic is related to the future, and you have the huge opportunity to bring very specific guidance to states on how to implement these principles on the different matters of the resolutions you negotiate. One could also think of one resolution on the topic, but this is I know that states are not very eager to have many new resolutions. I think that, for example, having a panel or a specific space where we can discuss about how these principles apply to the problems we have and what states can do at the national level, right? How do they legislate? How do adjudicators include the principles or continue including the principles in jurisprudence? How do national human rights institutions incorporate the intergenerational perspective? Could be very helpful. And I also think that it's important that special rapporteurs continue working on the topic. Thank you very much for being one of the first. And treaty bodies, we are also working with treaty bodies. And of course, this needs also an important participation of civil society. Civil society is documenting what is happening. Civil society bring the voices of the most affected so that you, with your vision for governance, can interact with the vision of the right holders, and we together can build up good guidance to states in a cooperative manner. I think in this way, this council could in some way build up on the declaration, filling the gaps and clarifying eventual contradictions.
Thank you. Anyone wants to? Yeah, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Very briefly, and on the basis of the insightful and thought-provoking remarks of the panelists, it brings me to the following, very brief from the top of my head. So if 30 years in diplomacy, many of which in the field of development, of human development, of sustainable development, have taught me anything, it is the two following takeaways. First of all, it may be pretty banal, but it is the recognition of the interrelatedness of all of our endeavors, with their beneficial and sometimes also very often even counterproductive effects on each other. And I think it's always useful to keep that in mind. The second takeaway relates to time. All development takes time. It takes time to change the minds, but it takes even more time to conceptualize and to implement the changes that then hopefully will trigger development. On this timeline, very often we have been looking, and we still are looking backwards to identify also the root causes of non-development around the world. Now, this is probably legitimate that we do that. But while we do that, we might also want to ask ourselves what we do today and what we do not today. What extent can it be the root causes of lack of development in the future? That's what's coming from the discussion. Thank you.
Elon, do you want to make a final comment? We have 1 minute.
Yeah, no, very quickly. I definitely think the issue should be on the agenda of the Human Rights Council. I don't see why it shouldn't be. Also, I actually think that, I don't know, my 35 years of work in human rights, I'm sorry to tell everybody that I'm less and less wanting to rely on national governments. I think the era of the nation state, even with the incredible backtracking that is taking place on governance, may be heading to an end. I'm sorry, it's very skeptical now, but keeping that in mind, I think it's very important to rely on, to work with national actors. So we need to work more directly on this issue of future generations with the national human rights institutions, with national civil society movements. We often forget with independent institutions at the national level, with indigenous groups, original groups who actually have that wisdom of future generations. And so we need to, in a sense, reorient some of the work we're doing. And I would be very happy to see everybody in this room go out and publicize the Maastricht Principles. We are going to have a commentary available very soon. We're going to try to produce them in different languages. And I hope that using that and other material that is available, including Special Rapporteur's work, we need to just do more education and publicity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We were hoping to have time for a Q&A, but we have some coffee and refreshments outside. So hopefully we can move some of the questions outside of the room. We have another solid half hour outside. So please stick around and don't hesitate to reach out to the panelists to continue the conversation. Thank you very much once again. This is one of the more events that we will be organizing on this matter, and we really look forward to your support to enhance the implementation of the rights of future generations. Thank you very much.